right, in this session we're going to talk about another of O'Connor's stories, and that's her story, Good Country People. What's interesting about this story compared with the previous story we talked about, A Good Man is Hard to Find, is that Good Country People is more complex, it's longer, and it introduces some elements that are not present in A Good Man is Hard to Find. At the same time, it maintains the central features of O'Connor's writing, and that is the need for self-knowledge and the need for the intervention of some sort of violent grace in order for us to be able to receive that self-knowledge. So what's new about this particular story? We discussed in earlier sessions the concept of nihilism and O'Connor's concern with that, O'Connor's understanding of the German philosopher Nietzsche, and the things that she agreed with and the things that she disagreed with in that. So in this story, what makes it complex then is you have an additional theme that's weaving its way through the themes that are already present in all of her writing, but it's a very interesting interplay. But for that reason, we can only touch on a few of the highlights of this. At the same time, I need to give another spoiler alert. If you haven't read the story, you ought to stop and read it, because we're going to go to the conclusion in just a moment, and you just will have deprived yourself of a wonderful experience in reading the story for the first time, beginning to end. So in Good Country People, the central character is a woman named Helga. And I think what's important to keep in mind about Helga is that she's a very wounded individual. She's a very wounded soul, and that is symbolized by her wooden leg. According to the story, she lost her leg when she was a young girl in a hunting accident, and she's suffered ever since and has had to accommodate herself to her prosthetic. At the same time, she's no dummy, at least when it comes to academics. So she has obtained a PhD in philosophy. Now, this brings up yet one more concern of O'Connor's, and that's her concern with education, especially with higher education. Her concern is embodied in Helga, because as her mother in one episode reflects on her daughter's education, she concludes that it had not done her any good. That is to say, it had not been a good idea, and that she is the worst for having pursued a doctorate in philosophy. Now, with that said, let's read a very short passage about her education. So, according to O'Connor, the girl had taken the PhD in philosophy, and this left Mrs. Hopewell at a complete loss. Mrs. Hopewell, of course, being her mother. You could say, my daughter is a nurse, or my daughter is a school teacher, or even my daughter is a chemical engineer. You could not say, my daughter is a philosopher. That was something that had ended with the Greeks and Romans. All day Joy sat on her neck in a deep chair reading. Sometimes she went for walks, but she didn't like dogs or cats or birds or flowers or nature or nice young men. She looked at nice young men as if she could smell their stupidity. Now, I have to quickly interject that I made sure that both of my daughters read that last line about her impatience with young men and the fact she could smell their stupidity. I'd like my daughters at least to adopt that skill that we see in Helga. So Helga's not the only character in O'Connor's stories who seems to have been worsened by higher education, but in Helga's case, what she has acquired is an interest in nihilism or nothingness. And O'Connor demonstrates through this character the arrogance that comes with that attitude. At one point she says, I'm not like everybody else, I can see through to nothing. And this is the fascinating yet troubling feature of nihilism. That is, we have to get past everything we've relied on up to this point and be able to see to nothingness, and somehow out of that nothingness, we are going to arrive at something greater. So the interesting action in the story is when a Bible salesman shows up at the door, and the family is taken with the Bible salesman. He sort of presumes himself into the family. He gets an invitation to dinner, and he shows an immediate interest in Holga. Now, we ought to pause and say, why in the world does she have an ugly name like Holga? What parents would have imposed this on a young child? Well, they didn't. Her name had been Joy, but at a certain point, Joy decided to change her name and to adopt, as O'Connor explains, the ugliest name that she could find. So it's sort of an act of defiance, and that's the reason she has the name Holga. So then what happens with this Bible salesman is Holga begins to get a bit intrigued with him, and this sort of fascinates her mother as she observes this happening. And Holga decides, I'm going to seduce this guy. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, and I'm going to disabuse him of the reliance that he puts on religion. And it's going to be an interesting project, but at some point, when all is said and done, he's going to be the better for it. So then, the next day, Holga agrees to take a walk with the Bible salesman, but very quickly it becomes evident that Holga is not in charge, that somehow this young, uneducated, sort of country, ignorant individual disarms her. He has the upper hand, and she immediately begins to feel off balance. So he takes charge, and he leads her into what she had planned to lead him, and that is some sort of a sexual encounter. So O'Connor describes this not in the kind of graphic detail that you would find in more modern novels or in contemporary movies. Nonetheless, for someone writing in the 1950s, this is pretty harsh stuff. So she describes an episode. They climb into the barn, into the loft, and the reader anticipates that, of course, there's going to be some sort of an encounter here. But once again, the Bible salesman, his name is Manly Pointer, he takes charge. So let's just read a passage and get a feel for what's going on with this. "You got to say it," he repeated. "You got to say you love me." She was always careful how she committed herself. "In a sense," she began, "if you use the word loosely, you might say that. But it's not a word I use. I don't have illusions. I'm one of those people who can see through to nothing." So what the reader sees at this point is Holga attempting to regain her equilibrium and attempting to gain the upper hand on Manly Pointer and carry out her own project, but she's unable to get that kind of balance. And he continues, and with some lewd suggestions and some lewd gestures, he violates her, but not in the ways you might expect. He takes her wooden leg. He asks her to show him how it fits on, and at a certain point, he won't give it back. And at this point, she's helpless. She screams at him to return it. So what's going on with this? Well, what we ought to refer to is a few pages earlier, O'Connor, in a couple of episodes, describes what this prosthetic means to her. O'Connor writes at one point, she cared for it as if someone might care for her soul. So in her spiritual emptiness, in the nothingness that she's created in her life, this wooden leg symbolizes at least a couple of things. One is it somehow is a substitute soul for her, and on the other hand, it demonstrates just how wounded she is. The literary critic Alan Tate said at one point about this story, "It's the most disturbing story of a maimed soul I have ever read." So when Manly Pointer takes her prosthetic, then in a sense, she has been victimized by the very nothingness that she had embraced. And why do we say that? Well, because Manly Pointer actually demonstrates that he knows a lot more about nihilism, even if it is in a rural country sort of way, than she does. And she has embraced something that is only getting her in trouble and is going to leave her spiritually destitute. Let's look at a couple of lines that help us to understand that. And I'll tell you another thing, Holga, he said, using the name as if he didn't think much of it. You ain't so smart. I've been believing in nothing ever since I was born. And then the toast-colored hat disappeared down the hole, and the girl was left sitting on the straw in the dusty sunlight. When she turned her churning face toward the opening, she saw his blue figure struggling successfully over the green speckled lake. So once again, who is Manly Pointer? What's going on philosophically in all of this? Manly Pointer, I think, represents sort of the nature of nihilism itself. He represents this idea philosophically and culturally that we can break away from everything that has carried our civilization to this point, and we can move forward. But in order to do that, at least as a kind of a transition, we have to be willing to embrace a kind of a nothingness. We have to be willing to become nihilists, at least and so we can begin to create something new. What O'Connor is saying about this is that Manly Pointer represents sort of the nature of nihilism itself. And so Holga is victimized by that because she had come to play with something through her education and through her woundedness. She's come to play with something and embrace something that she really doesn't understand. And what has happened is that it has turned back on her, and with the idea of drawing her into a kind of a destruction. The whole time, this spirit of nihilism has been disguised in the character of this odd Bible salesman. Now, in the passage that we just read, there's another interesting line, and it says something about Manly Pointer as he has descended out of the hayloft and carrying her wooden leg and leaving her in the hayloft with only one leg. It says that he was walking across the lake. It doesn't say that he walked toward the lake. It doesn't say that he walked around the lake. He was walking across the lake. Now, that's an interesting way to put things, but if you'll recall from earlier sessions, we said that O'Connor's economy of writing is such that at times it's important to pay attention to every word. So I think a valid understanding of what we're talking about here is that Manly Pointer comes, who else walks on water? Well, Christ himself, of course. So wait a minute, I thought Manly Pointer was nihilist, and now you're saying he's Christ? No. O'Connor explains in a lot of her stories, in order to get her characters to the place where they acquire the self-knowledge that they need violent grace, right? And there is a theological dimension to that grace, and that's a kind of a divine grace. It's a favor from God himself. So I think it's appropriate to understand that there is hope for Holga, and now that she's been shamed, and now that she has been left destitute, she's in a position where she can perhaps receive this grace that has come to her violently, and with the symbol of a Christ-like act. However, once again, it's a fleeting episode. O'Connor leaves us thinking about this rather than with a kind of satisfying resolution in which there might be another chapter and Helga starts going to church and teaching Sunday school or something like that. We don't know for sure what's going to have to happen to Helga in the future, but I think that can be explained fairly easily, as we have in reference to the other story, by O'Connor's technique, the nature of her art, and also her respect for the free will of her characters. And I think that enables us to better reflect on the message of her stories.